Representing Dover is Sheila Harris Marlin.
It's interesting, since I'm last and got to hear everybody else, the parallels there are between the small communities. Anyway, when Linda asked me if I would speak, I was delighted because Dover is my town. I was born there. My father was born in Rockaway, came to Dover when he was 5, and my mother was born in Hillsborough, Kansas. Hillsborough, Kansas, you say? And she came to Dover when she was 2. In 1975, my dad was asked to write a short history of the Dover Jewish community. From information gathered from available minutes, he reported that in 1882, 11 men, 8 from Dover, 1 from Stanhope, 1 from Boonton, and 1 from Rockaway, possibly my grandfather, formed the Dover Hebrew Association. Their main goal was to establish a Hebrew day school. Their religious guide was a Reverend DeSola Mendes from the very famous DeSola Pool family. Reverend Mendes had a home in Rockaway. Why? I have no idea. Did they ever get to school? I don't know that either. But anyway, this group functioned until 1897. By then, the Jewish population had doubled and broader organization was needed. So the Dover Hebrew Literary Society was founded. I love the fancy names. This time with 24 men from Dover and 3 from Rockaway. They established a Sunday school and started other appropriate Jewish activities. Among their most successful activities was a semi-formal whist and dance with tickets by invitation only, which netted them $200 a year. Lectures and timely debates were offered, the records noting that they were always, quote, always in good taste. The society purchased 1.5 acres of high ground in Dover, and that's now our Mount Sinai Cemetery. During the Spanish-American War, the society offered help to any destitute family, Jewish or Gentile, who had a family member serving in M Company, which was the Dover outfit. For festivals and holidays, they imported a cantor and rented Torahs from New York. The cantors went for $30, and the Torahs were $2.50 each. In the late 1890s, my grandfather moved from Rockaway to Dover, where there were now 30 Jewish families, and he founded the Adath Israel congregation. Minyanim met in private homes, but because my grandparents had a larger than average parlor, it became the shul. Shabbos services, yahrzeits, bar mitzvahs, everything was celebrated there. The congregation bought a Torah. Grandpa built an ark out of wooden packing cases, and Grandma made the covers. So far, I followed the history as reported by my dad, which was concerned only with the Orthodox community. But my late mother often spoke of her family's affiliation with a fairly large Reform group who met for years on Friday nights only in various homes. I have no further knowledge of what happened to that congregation, what they did on the high holidays. I don't know. And if anybody else from our area has information about it, I'm sure we'd all love to hear it. Now, we also had an intermarriage in Dover. I'm told that my parents' marriage was viewed as one because my mother was of the Reform group and my father was the son of the head of the Orthodox group. In 1915, the Ladies Auxiliary of Adath Israel was formed as a fundraising and social group. Ethel Schomburn was the perpetual secretary because the meetings were conducted in Yiddish, and she was the only one who could write the minutes in both Yiddish and English. In World War I, Picatinny Arsenal and Hercules Powder Company brought in quite a few new people, many of whom stayed in the area. Okay, now we're coming up to my time and memories. As Dover and the Jewish population grew, Shul moved to a third-floor apartment on Blackwell Street. I remember it vaguely. It was 2 connecting rooms, one with a large oilcloth draped table, and the other room set up with chairs sanctuary style. There was a wood-burning stove between the 2 rooms, and every so often a Hebrew teacher would be hired, and all available interested Jewish kids were lumped together in one class. Now, you heard before what happened. Every time we got a new teacher, he'd start again with page 1. I therefore know Ba Ba Ba, frontwards and backwards, and I know about a third of the Hebrew alphabet really well. By the early 30s, the auxiliary was still going strong, and the congregation still meeting in the 2 small rooms. But for the high holidays, Adath Israel rented a ballroom in not too beautiful downtown Dover. It was on the 2nd floor of a now non-existent building. To convert it to an Orthodox sanctuary, a portable ark was installed, rented folding chairs arranged, and a cloth divider hung down the middle of the room, separating, of course, the men and the women. It was called, at that time, Elite Hall, E-L-I-T-E. I'm sure today we'd call it Elite Hall. And it later became, to give you an idea of the size, a roller skating rink. It was really a big shul. In the mid-30s, with 40 Jewish families, the Dover Jewish Center was built. Without the zeal and determination of William and Bella Youngelson, there is no question but what there never would have been a building at that time. It was right in the middle of the Depression. Mr. and Mrs. Youngelson hired a master carpenter, Bob Campbell. Where the plans came from, were there any plans, I don't know. But I do know that the Youngelsons and Bob built the Orchard Street building. I also remember Bob Campbell, a tall, white-haired, good-looking Scotchman with quite a brogue, who never worked in the building without wearing a yarmulke. I also seem to remember Friday afternoons when someone, possibly one of the Youngelsons, would go from door to door down Blackwell Street, from merchant to merchant, and of course they were almost all Jewish, looking for money to pay Bob for his week's work. The Dover Jewish Center changed my life and that of many Jews in Dover. There were 3 grammar schools, so we kids really didn't know each other except for meeting on the high holidays or when the intermittent Hebrew school classes came. But now we had a centrally located building. Most of us could walk there from our homes. And virtually all of the first activities, of course, were fundraising, shows, dinners, card parties, dances, all in an almost finished building. The original building housed meeting/classrooms, a small chapel, offices, sanctuary, and a large gymnasium, which served as our big meeting room. During and after World War II, the Jewish population exploded. In 1949, the sisterhood numbered 200, and at one time we had over 300 Jewish families. Family members, that is. About the time when capacity membership would have been reached, new synagogues were established in the county, and we leveled off at about 225 to 250 members. Life was good in Dover, and it's interesting that I note here that possibly there was some anti-Semitism, but I was never touched by it. We had a mayor, John Roach Jr., who served the town in all for 28 years. He was always a good friend and actively supported our Jewish community. Around 1950 or so, a group of us raised enough money to send Mayor Roach on a mission to the brand new state of Israel. I'm not sure who made all of the arrangements, but he was provided with transportation, hotels, spending money, and an itinerary which included meetings with many Israeli officials. The Dover Jewish Center sponsored a very active Boy Scout troop and provided at various times meeting space for UJA, Hadassah, Israel Bonds, American Jewish Congress, and the best Sunday morning ZOA ran for years, bar none. It was a Sunday morning brunch that was wonderful, and I have to add here, a friend of mine who was not Jewish used to bring his daughter down. Tony belonged to the ZOA, and he would bring his daughter down to the breakfast, and he said to me one time, "Would you please explain to Patty that this is not Jewish Sunday school?" In interfaith, nursery school was considered the best in town. We must have been well regarded by our national affiliates because we were always on the list for speakers too, and we also had Eleanor Roosevelt, and you mentioned Joey Adams. I had forgotten him. And I know that one time we were supposed to have Myron Cohn. He couldn't make it, so disappointedly, we accepted Sam Levinson as his substitute. An active sisterhood with many talented women raised money, hosted parties, organized bazaars, wrote and performed shows, on and on. Their history would make another whole program. During the 1950s, a tract of land abutting our synagogue was purchased, and in the 1960s, growing pains set in. A new building was, after great surus, dedicated in 1966. It contained classrooms, a library, a rabbi study, and a beautiful large social hall with a really nice big stage. Some few years later, a sanctuary was added, and our old building was sold. Now we're up to the 70s and the 80s. They were exciting and busy times. Both social and religious activities were at a peak. By then, we had survived a number of religious and lay leaders and a couple of whopper congregational disagreements, and things seemed to be on an even keel until inflation and the beginning of a membership decline caused big financial problems. The bank was breathing down our neck, and in desperation, we started a weekly bingo game. In great ignorance and even greater mazel, our opening game was, by chance, on the night of the Christian Holy Thursday. Now, churches don't run bingo during Holy Week. We were overwhelmed. We were the only game in town. We turned away so many people that night for lack of space and supplies, but we netted over $1,000. We and the bank president, who had come to look over his investment, went home with smiles. And then, for many explainable reasons, membership continued dropping, and the once thriving, beautiful Dover Jewish Center was fast becoming a congregation of seniors. The Hebrew school population was very low, so a shidduch with Boonton's Jewish congregation with their many young people and lots of children was a natural. So in the 1990s, it was farewell to the almost, a sad farewell, I must say, to the almost 100-year-old Adath Israel Dover Jewish Center, and Mazel Tov to Adath Sholem. When I speak with old friends from the Dover Jewish family, we remember a warmth and camaraderie that seemed to be special to us. We have not yet been able to define it exactly, but we remember that those of us who were privileged to be members of our community in its heyday know that we were part of a very special piece of Dover Jewish history. I thank you.
Our next speaker is Harold Kraus, who will talk about Morristown's Jewish history.
Good afternoon. I was going to say that we are all young here today, but listening to Linda, she advanced my age by 4.5 years. I was 8.5 years old when the Kraus family moved to Morristown, and you can calculate my age because it was then 1928. Thanks a lot. I was curious as to what brought the Jewish people into Morristown and into the other areas of Morris County. And actually, Morristown will surely be, in a few years, 300 years old, the town itself. And it was established in 1715. There were no Jews there at that time. It was named Morristown in 1738, and it became the county seat of Morristown in 1739. 1880, Morristown became probably the most wealthy town in the United States. There were millionaires lining both sides of Madison Avenue all the way to Madison with magnificent homes. First people to come into Morristown were the Meyer Friedman from 1893, and the Minces came a little later, and the Salneys a little later. Practically all of them started by peddling throughout the countryside. And in fact, some of the families lived in New York, and the boys would start out in the morning, get over into New Jersey, and walk as far as Plainfield. And in a couple of years, they prospered, and they opened stores, and they began to open stores on Speedwell Avenue. And when I came to Morristown at 8 and a half, the Speedwell Avenue was the most busy place in the town, and it was practically all Jewish. You could walk down the street and you could see the kosher butcher shop, you could see Drell's Chicken Market, you could go into the Army and Navy store, Danziger's Bakery, Barnett's Pharmacy, Greenberger's, Schwartz's Meat Butcher Shop on the corner of High Street. Salneys, who had come into the town much earlier, David before Harry, both of them were peddlers before they opened up their stores, and they made enough in a couple of years to buy a wagon for $5 and a horse. And David bought a little store on Speedwell Avenue opposite where they were situated later on High Street. And he paid $180 for the store, complete with the inventory. He paid a little of it in cash and assumed most of the other debts. And within 2 years, they did so well. Harry came down and joined him, and then they wanted to expand the store, and the landlord wouldn't let them, so they bought the building across the street, knocked it down, and built the Salney Brothers store on the corner of High Street and Speedwell Avenue, which is now Catano Place. The Minces came into Morristown and moved to 4 Race Street, and they had 7 boys. And that became really the headquarters and the beginnings of the Morristown Jewish Center. They wanted to have a minyan. There was no synagogue in Morristown, and if you really wanted to go to services for the High Holy Days, you had to go to Newark or New York, and that was a long walk. If you had a horse, it was a good ride too. But Max Mintz became a peddler, and I'm sure you all know what peddling was. A young man would, in the morning, put a pack on his back weighing up to 100, 150 pounds and trudge through the forests and the land, calling on the farmers and the people in the houses, and sell whatever was in the pack on his back. And if it was raining or if it was cold and he had no place to sleep, very often they slept out in the woods or in a barn if they were lucky, or a farmer's house. And from that they made a living and built a family and established themselves. Getting back to the Salneys, when they opened their big store across the street, they were still peddling, but they had a horse and wagon. And Harry would go out one day, and David would take care of the store, and then Harry would take care of the store the next day, and so on, and they would alternate. And they built themselves a very large business and a very important business. There was Greenberger's on Speedwell Avenue, Capel's, you name it, all the way down Cohn's Butcher Shop, Feldman's Butcher, non-kosher butcher shop across the street. It was really the marketplace for the town. And Western Avenue, right next to the courthouse, became, you might call it the Park Avenue of Morristown Jewry. As the merchants prospered, many of them moved up to live on Western Avenue, and there were non-Jewish people there too, but it was really considered the acme of a place to live in the city and in the town. And the Jews really began to live all over town, mixing in with non-Jews, and yet there was a respectful distance between them. There were church communities here in the area that would not allow Jews or dogs to buy property. The country clubs, several of them, would not allow Jews to be members, but everybody still managed to get along. Just an aside for a moment, before all of this occurred, there was a Jewish family that came to Morristown prior to the Civil War by the name of Sayers. And they were in the horse business, and they sold horses to the cavalry, the Union Cavalry. And they had a huge stable on Speedwell Avenue, and they lived on Early Street. And there were 3 generations, and the last generation was Albert. And when he passed away in 1971, he had been quite agile in the stock market early on and had amassed quite a fortune. He left $100,000 to Memorial Hospital, $100,000 to All Souls Hospital, $25,000 to the St. Margaret's, $25,000 to the Morristown Jewish Community Center, of which he was never a member, and also to the Temple Bethel AME Church and to the Presbyterian Church on the Green. In case you're not aware of it, just for your own curiosity, the Green is not owned by the town of Morristown, it's owned by the church. And when Morris County was made the county seat and the courthouse was built, there were quite a number of hangings on the Green. That doesn't occur anymore. But getting back to the Minces on 4 Ray Street, they tried to have minions and they had insufficient people, a number of people. You had to have 10, and they had to get 3 people from New York to constitute a minion. They also started a little Hebrew school, and in 1899 they incorporated as the House of Israel in Morristown. And 2 of the Mintz boys went to New York and they bought a little bit of Torah for $35. The 7 boys all chipped in $5 apiece. And they proceeded to hold daily minyan services there, but they still had to go to the big city, to Newark, which had over 35 different synagogues, and to New York for a service. And so they began to, as more Jews started coming into Morristown, they went from one meeting hall to another for a number of years, and the women, God bless them, decided enough was enough, and around 1918, a sisterhood was formed in 1816, and in, 1916. In 1918, a committee was formed, and a plot of land was purchased on Speedwell Avenue, where the synagogue now stands, the Morristown Jewish Community Center, Bet Yisroel. And nothing happened. Nothing happened for 10 years. And the women finally said, if something isn't decided, what you're going to do with that land, there was a big old Victorian house on it, 3-story, and it had been renovated so that the first floor was the sanctuary, and the second floor was sort of general meeting places, and the third floor was a little Hebrew school. My dad put me in there as soon as we moved to Morristown. Any of the women said, we've had this property now for 10 years. Nothing has happened. Nobody can make up their mind what they're going to do about it. We're going to go ahead and form our own Hebrew school. And they had $5,000, and they were ready to do it. Well, I guess that galvanized the men, and they got an architect, and they decided that they would go ahead with the plans of building a Morristown Jewish Community Center. And the cornerstone was laid in 1929. I was in the crowd watching it, and the Boy Scouts were lined up on the top. Mr. Epstein, Maurice Epstein, was then the president, and Milton Schlesser was the vice president. And prior to that, though, the women also had a fundraising dinner. They raised $38,000, and Full contributed $1,000 of his own money. And the building finally got started in 1929. And when it was finished, it was really a wonderful work. Huge sanctuary, relatively speaking at that time, with a basketball court, classrooms, a small area for daily minion services. It was strictly Orthodox. And for a while, I noticed that not too many women were in the services. They weren't segregated, but there just weren't too many. And then as time went on and younger people came in, they began to realize that the younger people were not as Orthodox. And so a split occurred within the building. The small minion area was enlarged, and the Orthodox became part of that, and the conservative stayed in the main sanctuary. Later on, as more young people came into the area, the younger people were not interested in Orthodoxy nor into conservative, and suddenly we had a Reform congregation in the building. And the feeling was that the community was still too small for any of them to leave, that it would have destroyed everybody. And so for about 6 or 7 years, the Morristown Jewish Community Center had 3 congregations with rabbis and cantors and boards of directors. But the dominant board of directors was the one that was put in originally for the Morristown Jewish Community Center. It was a noteworthy thing to do. The Reform rabbis in Cincinnati were against it, but it survived for about 7 years, and then the Reform went on their own way and now have Temple B'nai Or with a huge membership, Reform, and there is an Orthodox synagogue in Morristown on Cutler Street. They emanated from the Morristown Jewish Community Center. The young people really had a great opportunity when the building was open because everything was happening in that Jewish Community Center, from Hebrew school on up to services. There were all kinds of activities going on. Practically every major Jewish organization in town met at the Jewish Center. And we had notable speakers over the years. We had Eleanor Roosevelt. We had Joey Adams. We had Dr. Gordon, who was one of the principals behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had Dr. Mortimer Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement. We had a very wonderful program of plays, dramas. Meyer Friedman, who came in much earlier, established a junior orchestra in the building, and his son Myron Friedman, Meyer was the grandfather, Abe was the father, and Myron is the grandson. And we were all very close at that time. There was Boy Scouts, all kinds of things going on. As a matter of fact, sometimes there wasn't a space for all the activities that were taking place. It was a very warm, cohesive, enervating, intellectual experience. It's difficult to condense all of this in 10 or 15 minutes, but it was really a remarkable, and still is, a remarkable achievement on the part of the Jewish people that came into Morristown and went out into the ages. I must say that we thought for a long time that we were the oldest Jewish congregation in Morris County. It's not true, but in those days, even though we played basketball against Dover and sometimes against Pine Brook, sent their players to play with us, but I don't think too many people venture out to see where Pine Brook was. And so in our ignorance, we thought we were dominant, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
We have a lot of talent in Morris and Sussex. Our speakers for Mount Freedom are Shirley Kapner Roden and her brother Sherman, and they will also side by side.
First, we want to thank you, Linda, for asking us to spend some time with you today to reminisce about Mount Freedom. In the weeks we spent thinking and talking about this project with each other and with our Mount Freedom friends, we have been hit with strong bouts of nostalgia. We all love to remember and talk about those wonderful years. The phones have been busy and the emails flying. For years, we have played a game called Mount Freedom Trivia. In other words, we have had a great time, put our ramblings on paper, and hope you enjoy it half as much as we have. Our discussion today is in no way meant to represent an accurate historical story of Mount Freedom. It is rather a conversation about our recollections and discussions with friends. We hope to give you a flavor of what our hometown, our American shtetl, was like, how we remember it, and how we were told about it. When my mother would tell some story of the past, she would often conclude the story with a pause, a sigh, and say, "It's like a dream." Here is our dream of Mount Freedom as we remember it. Long before the Jewish presence in Mount Freedom, our town was known as Walnut Grove. Legend has it that George Washington wintered in Morristown. He passed through this elevated area, spanned the view, and felt peace and proclaimed Mount Freedom. True or not, I find it a lovely story. It was a lazy farm community with a Methodist church and a Presbyterian church. There was no Jewish or Catholic presence. The people were farmers and miners with a general store and a one-room schoolhouse. In the early 1900s, we estimate about 1910, a family by the name of Friedberg bought the small general store. Shortly thereafter, Mr. and Mrs. Levine bought a farm on Brookside Road. This became the first Jewish hotel in Mount Freedom, and the first Jewish baby, now Yetta Steinberg Masarsky, was born there. Much of Yetta Levine's, formerly Steinberg family, came to the farm with her. Friends and family from New York, our father among them, would come to the farm, the hotel, to get away from the city. There were wonderful stories about those carefree days. Yoelish Steinberg married Rosie Schreiber, Hybe Steinberg married Annie, Charlie Steinberg married Dinah, and Rosie Steinberg married Moshe Yussel Reagan. After Mr. Levine died, the hotel was sold to the Saines family. Rosie and Yoelish remained in Mount Freedom, buying property next to what would become the Mount Freedom Synagogue. The others continued to vacation in Mount Freedom and ultimately bought homes there too. Annie and Jaime bought the store originally owned by Friedberg. This eventually became the famous Little Broadway. We are not sure how people coming from New York in those days got to Mount Freedom after getting off the train in Morristown, but we assume the 6-mile ride was by horse and wagon. And so it was, the first form of a hotel in Mount Freedom started and flourished. Other families followed: Messer, Rosenfarb, Claude, Fishman, Salnick, Zudik, Saines, Zimmerman, Winarski, Hirschon, Drillman, Tenzer, Lieberman, Saltz. Bessie Tenzer, Pauline Lieberman, and Isidore Saltz were siblings. Each bought a farm that grew to a hotel, and the foundation for a summer resort was established. Others followed: Claude's, Mount Carmel, later to become Ackerman's, Messrs, Saines, Salnick's, Margolins became Pine Hill Lodge, Zudik's Plaza Hotel, and the town grew. It followed naturally that rentals be established, the Kochelanes, first with rooms in local houses, then with small additions, and then with bungalows and bungalow colonies. Mount Freedom became a major summer resort. We like to call it the southernmost tip of the Borscht Belt. It had mountain elevation, fresh air, and was much closer to New York City than the Catskills. When the summers were over, we were left with our little shtetl. Most of the Jewish people were Polish, Russian, and other European first-generation immigrants. The time had come for the Balabatin to establish a Jewish community within the existing Protestant community. The first step was a shul.
So building the shul for the Hebrew congregation became a community project with donations of money, material, and skills. I know much of the carpentry was done by Harry Zudik, Morris Claude, and David Rosen. The shul had electricity, but no inside plumbing or running water. It had a lovely interior, and one can only imagine the joy felt in the community at its completion and dedication. The structure has been enlarged and upgraded many times, but the original sanctuary is still there as a special, revered place to many of us who consider it part of our roots. There was a large foyer in front of the sanctuary that served as a cheder, the Hebrew school. It had about 20 desks and a table for the rabbi. Books could be written about our experiences there. A small-time rabbi had many duties. Classes were often interrupted when someone stopped by to have the rabbi chef to kill a chicken. There was a small stove in the corner that burned wood, and I think of it every time I hear the Yiddish song, Auf'm Pripitschuk brennt a fire. We would study Aleph Beis, learn to read Yiddish and Hebrew, and study some Chumash. The problem was that every time a new student enrolled, we would all start over again from Breishis in the beginning. The rabbi had a small wooden club that he used to keep order. He usually tapped the desk, but didn't hesitate to slap the knuckles when a situation warranted. We were an Orthodox congregation, but the boys and girls studied together. An important function of the cheder was to prepare the boys for bar mitzvah. I don't remember any bat mitzvahs for the girls in those days. Part of the class day for the bar mitzvah boy, we used to study for a big day, and of course, additional tutoring was arranged. Let me tell you a little about my bar mitzvah. Just as I started my studies in 1937-38, our rabbi left for another position and was left to me, my father, and Izzy Hirshhorn to prepare the service and the Today I Am a Man speech. My family and I got through the trauma, and then came the party. The small foyer in front of the shul was transformed from a cheder to a banquet hall by replacing the desks with 3 long tables in the shape of a U. My mother covered them with her best tablecloths, and we were ready to party. Mrs. Salnick provided her traditional bushel of homemade ayakichel, and Tante Rosie Steinberg her famous rugelach. My mother, a Litvak, made platters of her famous chopped herring. There was honey cake, sponge cake, gefilte fish, and whiskey and wine for a kiddush. I made a speech and accepted my ivory prayer book from the Ladies' Auxiliary and my Chumash from the Hebrew congregation. Family from New York and New Jersey were there. My maternal grandmother died before I was born, and my paternal grandmother was in Poland, later to be lost in the Holocaust. My mother's oldest sister, Aunt Pearl, was our surrogate grandmother, and we all loved her very much. She came all the way from Plainfield and stayed overnight. It wasn't a weekend affair at a hotel, but it was wonderful. I spoke earlier about our rabbis. It took a special kind of person to be a rabbi in a small town like Mount Freedom. Today, a home is provided for the rabbi, but in those days, he provided his own housing. In addition to being the spiritual leader, he was a cantor, Hebrew school teacher, shochet, performed funeral services, weddings, and much more. He was also secretary to the congregations, since minutes were written in Yiddish at that time. The rabbis I remember were Hertzberg, Slachowski, Varshavyak, and Przansky. I was closest to Rabbi Slachowski. He rented a room from the Steinbergs, who lived next door to the shul. He came from Poland to America without his wife and 4 children. He was very well received, and in a short time sent for his family. They rented a house near the shul, next to the shul near the Reagans. Incidentally, that house was the original one-room schoolhouse of Mount Freedom. His family spoke no English, but adapted very well, making friends, learning English, and were very bright.
Most of the social life centered around the shul. The Ladies' Auxiliary was very active. I am proud to say that my mother was a charter member and a longtime secretary. We have some of her minutes from 1934 that include comments about the small attendance due to bad weather and about a committee to visit Mrs. Saltz, who was sick. Meetings were originally held in each other's homes in the evenings. There were no babysitters. The kids came along and had meetings and games of their own. The Ladies' Auxiliary gave considerable financial support to the congregation. They had raffles, card parties, costume dances, and the very ambitious annual trip to New York 2nd Avenue Yiddish Theater. After a single viewing, many of the ladies could sing the songs of Aaron Lebedorf, Molly Picone, and Menashe Skolnick word for word. For years, Mount Freedom buried their dead in the Morristown Cemetery. As the community grew and aged, the need for a local cemetery became apparent. Many people were involved, but the driving force was Sam Rudy. Land was purchased in Ironia, and the legal and other steps were taken to establish a beautiful cemetery. Sadly, one of the earliest burials there was Stanley, son of Molly and Sam Rudy. A few years later, during World War II, the community suffered the loss of another of its young men, Sidney Heistine. He is buried in a place of honor, memorializing all our servicemen who lost their lives in the war. You didn't have to be related to have a Tanta. There was Tanta Rosie, Tanta Jenny, Tanta Annie, and more. But the Tanta, just plain Tanta Levine, later Pressman. Our mother, as well as most of the Jewish women, were responsible for starting a PTA in the Mount Freedom Grammar School. School let out at 3:30, and Monday through Thursday we went right to Hebrew school. That left Friday after school open. Two lovely spinster sisters named Butterworth sponsored the Sunshine Club each Friday, weather permitting. The girls learned sewing and the boys woodworking. It was another coming together beyond the classroom. There was more with the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. It was slow and subtle, but the communities got to know and trust each other. By the 1940s, Mount Freedom had a Jewish Justice of the Peace, Bernard Hershon, Police Chief George Oken, Magistrate Mike Schulman, Court Clerk Sadie Schulman, Postmaster Jenny Kapner, and a few years later, Mayor Herbie Steinberg. We were part of the establishment. Mount Freedom grew by leaps and bounds. However, it was still a small town, and so with the use of the automobile, we were able to become closer to our neighboring towns, mainly Morristown and Dover. I recently found a program of a dance held in Tenzer's Fairmont Hotel on June 20th, 1940, and the names listed were a combination of both Mount Freedom and Morristown people. The advertisers were very interesting. Bendora Dairy, Popular Market, M&N Hardware were among them. And then the war came. If anything, this brought the Jewish communities together more. Many social clubs came into being. These remained, and when the servicemen came home, they seemed to be pleased to find a place to meet old and new friends. I am happy to say that's where I met my husband. How else could a girl from Mount Freedom meet a boy from Providence, Rhode Island? He worked at Picatinny Arsenal. And I was not the only lucky one. The social clubs were responsible for many marriages.
By now, Mount Freedom was becoming more of a community of all year-round homes. The population grew, as did everything else. The shul enlarged, running water was added, rooms for meetings, Hebrew school, and so forth. As all this was happening, so was the big change in Mount Freedom as the hotels slowly started to close. For us old-timers, it was a difficult thing to see, but that's progress. Today, there are about 150 families belonging to the Mount Freedom Hebrew congregation. Mount Freedom moved from shtetl to town. A new generation of young Jewish families arrived in the 1940s. The Leons had a knitting lounge. The Skernicks had a grocery store. Jack and Morris Heistine opened an auto repair shop that later became J&M Constructions. The Adlers and then the Risers opened kosher butcher shops. The Wildhorns had a confectionery store and restaurant. The Mishkins and the Rosens had grocery stores to supplement Garfinkel's, Heistein's, and of course, Little Broadway. Our mother became postmaster after the Hulbert sisters retired. It had been run by the family for about 100 years. The civil service test was scheduled for mid-April at the Morristown Post Office. We had a heavy snowstorm that morning, and our 1929 Model A Ford couldn't make it over the snow-covered roads from Mount Freedom to Morristown. Very, very early in the morning, Mom was out on the road hailing down a farmer's milk truck to hitch a ride. She told us later of getting out of the truck and checking her coat to get rid of the cow smell. 8 people took the test for the $600 a year job. To our delight, Mom got the appointment. Our busiest time was Monday mornings when the waiters, busboys, and bellhops from the hotels came to send their tip money home by postal money order. More than one of them called the postmaster Mom. When we moved to new and larger quarters, there was a dedication ceremony. On the outdoor platform, draped with bunting and flags, was our U.S. representative, a postal inspector, the local Protestant minister, our local rabbi, Herbie Steinberg, our mayor, and postmaster, Jenny Kapner. They all spoke, but we were especially proud of how well Mom spoke and conducted herself. And so, with all the sunrises and sunsets, the years have gone swiftly by. Tevye had to leave his shtetl, but we still have ours and all its wonderful memories. Mom would say, it's like a dream.
I'd like to start on my right with Helen Schrager, who will speak about Pine Brook, or originally known as Chevra Agudat Achim Anshi.
I was not privileged to be born in Pine Brook. I moved there in 1966, and I love history, I love the people, and they took me to all their houses and they told me all the stories. And most of the stories that I'm going to tell you today comes from a book written by Henrietta Kana Waxberg. And I don't think there are any Kanas in the audience, but we do have Levitt, we do have Beta, we do have Libeskind here. And I told them that if I make any mistakes, to please discuss it with me later. I can only give you Henrietta Waxberg Kana's impression of Pine Brook. In 1880, the first Jewish settlers moved to Pine Brook, and the minions were held in the private homes. The Kana family came from Austria in, I guess, about 1880, and they settled in Newark. And Joseph Kana married Lena Satz, and they settled in Newark. They had a number of children, and when he got too sick to work in the city, they came out to Pine Brook, 12 miles from Newark. And he was a very religious man, so he came to a town that did have Jews living in there. There was a minyan in the town when they moved in the early 1880s, and the services were held in the home of the Halperns. When Mr. Kana lived in Newark, he belonged to B'nai Abraham. Now, they bought this farm 12 miles from Newark. The farm had 20 acres. Now, 12 miles from Newark today might take us 25 minutes. I'm sure by horse and buggy then, it must have been a 3-hour trip there and a 3-hour trip back. So to go to Newark to sell the produce was a full day's job. As I said, there was a minyan in Pine Brook, and that's why the Kanas moved here. They needed help on their farm, and they hired a man, and in those days, they paid him $12 a month salary with room and board. At the time the Kanas came to town, Pine Brook had about 200-year history of Dutch settlers. And the Mrs. James Vreeland and Mrs. Van Ness, they were afraid to open the doors because these were Jewish people and they had never seen Jewish people. Later on, Henrietta writes, "These nice people in Pine Brook never came in contact with any other nationality until the Jewish people settled here. Certainly, it was a nice, quiet life. Brotherhood was very much in evidence, and everybody knows and likes his neighbors." There was a man called Bill Corter, who was the Justice of the Peace, and he befriended the Kanas. And he also brought them food because there was a struggle in those years, and we today really can't envision that there wasn't any food in the house, there wasn't any coal for heat. But this happened to the early settlers in Pine Brook. The Kanas gave him a home, and he lived with them until he died. When money was scarce, somebody told the Kanas, if you go to Patterson to a bakery, you can buy day-old bread for 50 cents a barrel. And they went to Patterson, they bought a couple of barrels of bread, I guess it was every week, and they ate it, and they also fed it to the animals on the farm. They didn't have money for seed when they started their farms, and Henrietta found out that she could get the seeds and not have to pay for the seeds until the crops came in. And the month of June, to make a little extra money, Mrs. Connor and the children would pick strawberries and earn 2 cents a quart. For 5 hours of work, for Mrs. Connor, and I don't know how many children she had at the time, gave them $5 or $6, which was an awful lot of money at the time. Another way to pick up some money, somebody told them to take in a boarder, and they took in somebody who his health was very bad and he couldn't live in the cities, and he came out to Pine Brook, which was the country, and the boarder paid the Connor family $5 a week, which was phenomenal. At that time, they sold butter for 25 cents a pound, they sold pot cheese for 5 cents a pound, and they sold potatoes for 5 cents a bushel. In 1896, there were Jewish families in and around Pine Brook. That must have been Boonton, that was Hanover, that was Parsippany. It took a very, very big area. And at a party for one of the Connors' newest children, they decided it was time to incorporate a congregation. And Congregation Agudas Achim Anshe was incorporated in 1896 by Bill Corter, who was the Justice of the Peace. He wrote the charter for them. Some of the people that were at this party, some of the family names were Kana, Halpern, Urshowitz, Lipshansky, Nachenson, and Kalish. The Jewish women decided they wanted some input in the Jewish life in Pine Brook, and the Hebrew Ladies' Aid Society was formed with dues of 10 cents a month. The meetings were held in various homes, and this is a quote from Henrietta. Everybody bought new furniture and fixed up their homes and baked unusual varieties of cakes so the other members would know how well they baked. The sisterhood had a fund where they would give $100 interest-free, payable at $1 a month to any Jewish family in the Pine Brook area who needed help. And I know this fund went on way through the Depression. I don't know how much longer it did exist. And there was never, ever a Jewish family in the area that ever went on. In those days, they called it relief. In 1906, the Connor Hotel was so big and so prosperous that everybody said it was like being in the mountains. It was in the mountains. It was on the top of Hook Mountain in Pine Brook, which you see today as you get off Route 80 at the Pine Brook exit and you look up. The building's not there anymore, but that's where the Connor hotels were. And it was in the mountains. It was 104 steps from Changebridge Road. And anybody that wanted to go swimming would cross the street into the Passaic River and have to walk down 104 steps and up 104 steps. But they did have a driveway if you didn't want to walk the steps. In 1912, the Connor started the first automobile bus line from Caldwell to Pine Brook to bring the guests who, a lot of them would come from Newark out on a trolley, which ended in Caldwell. And the Connor boys would have this their bus line and would take the guests up to the hotel. In 1912 also, land was purchased for a synagogue, and the building was completed for the high holidays. The first wedding in the new temple was on November 24th, 1912, and it was the wedding of Rachel and Jake Connor. Now, I was given all the old ledges in 1971 when my husband Donald was president of the Pine Brook Jewish Center, and we were renovating, and there was no rooms for the records. So I had the old minute books, the old journals, and I read it. And the first entry was dated 1941, and it said, all the other minute books were burnt. So there's really nothing around that can tell us what happened up until that point. But in 1941, the sisterhoods, although Pine Brook wasn't called sisterhood at the time, the women's groups of Pine Brook, Caldwell, and Verona raised money to furnish a sunroom at the Camp Kilmer Hospital. The women of Pine Brook also joined B'nai B'rith, and the Caldwell, Verona, and Pine Brook areas had 110 paid members of their B'nai B'rith chapter. They raised $47,000 worth of war bonds, which was enough to purchase a small tank. And this group of women also raised money for the Red Cross, for UJA, and for Hillel. In 1950, the congregation was growing, and they were able to add a community center onto the original building, by the way, which had no bathrooms at the beginning. And when I moved in 1966, there was a bathroom that was this wide, one for the men and one for the women. They had taken a stairway up to the women's floor and built these two tiny little bathrooms, which left the synagogue with one staircase, which was a horrendous fire hazard. I really and truly don't know how they got away with it, but they did. But in 1950, they built a community center with another bathroom, with a large kitchen, and one classroom. In 1954, they raised enough money to build a rabbi's house. And in 1961, the congregation paid off the mortgage, and in 1961, they had a party for the mortgage burning. 1962, the Chevra changed its name to the Pine Brook Jewish Center, and the Hebrew Ladies Aid Society became the Sisterhood of the Pine Brook Jewish Center. But I was told the original synagogue was in the Sephardic style, and the walls had frescoes on it. When I moved in 1966, the bima was against the eastern wall, and the walls were covered in very simple wood paneling. These are some of the names that were with the Jewish community from the 1800s till 1950. Kana, Malakowski, Nachenson, Levitt, Halpern, Grossman, Oshowitz, Bloom, Schulman, Charlotte, Ekman, Lieboff, Coleman, Solans, Jay, Wynn, Goodman, Lepshansky, Green, Kittay, Waxberg, Liebeskind, Steck, Medwin, Cantor, Steppel, Spodak, Sirotkin, Bogart, Rosenstein, Handelman, Malovny, Beta, Ershowski, Schneider, Kalish, and Halpern. 1966. We had a very, very Orthodox rabbi. The women had to sit upstairs, which was hot as anything. The men sat downstairs. The women had no rights in this congregation. All the voting privileges were for the men. And we women decided that this wasn't for us. And in 1967, the rules were changed, and the women had the right to vote, and we had mixed seating in the sanctuary. 1970, the men's club was formed, sharing the sisterhood's burden of contributing to the temple finances. 1973, a major expansion of that original temple was completed, more than doubling the facilities. And in 1974, Rabbi Asher Krief came to the pulpit, and he was with us for 27 years. In 1980 was the first women's adult bar mitzvah class. In 1982, the building that we are in now was built, and this building had 11,000 square feet. A wonderful thing happened to the Pine Brook Jewish Center in 1995. The Lake Hiawatha Jewish Center merged with us, and because of this merge, we were able to fund an enormous expansion, which now has 33,000 square feet. 1996 was the 100th anniversary of our congregation, and that was the time that this new expansion took place. Today, in 2003, the Pine Brook Jewish Center has 500 families. It has 300 children in a Hebrew school. It has 100+ children in a nursery school in there. We have Rabbi Tzafir Lev, who just joined the congregation 2 years ago, and we have a cantor, Menachem Torum, who is our cantor now. Thank you very much.